Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. We're just going to wait one more minute to start because some people are logging in right now, so we will begin in about 1 minute. All right, I think we will get started just so we are conscious of time. Hello, everybody. My name is Nicole Cork. I am the Association Manager of iHEA's activities. Welcome, and thank you for registering for today's webinar, Will COVID-19 Derail Progress Towards the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, which was made possible by a grant provided by the International Development Research Center. Today's webinar is being translated from English to French, so if you do prefer to listen in French, we encourage you to adjust your language at the bottom of the screen. The webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, but we are recording it in both languages and we will be uploading it online afterwards. Before we begin the webinar, I just wanted to run through a couple of housekeeping items. If you do experience any technical issues during the webinar, you can contact technical support by clicking on the question mark on the bottom left of the screen. If you're using the app, you can click on the menu bar. Everyone on the line has been muted except for the speakers. You will not be able to unmute yourself, so please use the chat box for any questions or comments during the webinar. Comments and questions in the chat box can be translated from any language by moving your mouse over the comment and clicking translate. So we do encourage you to submit your questions and comments in the language that you feel most comfortable. Finally, we will be sending a brief survey out following this webinar, and we do encourage everybody to complete this as it is important in terms of offering future multilingual webinars. I'm now going to pass it over to our Executive Director, Diane McIntyre, who will introduce today's speaker.
Some people it's good morning, for some good evening. I just wanted to welcome everyone to this webinar and particularly to thank IDRC for funding that has allowed us to offer bilingual webinars with simultaneous translation. All I need to do, I'll come back later and I'll keep note of your questions so that we can pose them to Sue at the end of the webinar. But I just wanted to briefly introduce Sue Horton. She's the University Research Chair and Professor of Global Health Economics in the School of Public Health and Health Systems at the University of Waterloo, which is in Canada. She's got various degrees all the way through to PhDs in economics from Harvard University. And we're particularly pleased to have her do this webinar because she worked extensively on costing and prioritization of nutrition during the MDGs and is now working on non-communicable diseases, particularly cancer. And she has written on issues related to the Sustainable Development Goals, their financing and global governance issues. She's also Deputy Chair of the Lancet Commission on Diagnostics, which plans to report at some stage during 2021. So thank you, Sue, for being willing to present in this webinar, and I'm certainly looking forward to hearing your insights. Over to you, Sue.
Good morning. It's from all over the world, so that's just great. And please, if you have comments or questions, please send them in the chat and we will take them up after my presentation, which should be about 20-25 minutes. So Okay, so at the outset, I should say this is not going to be a technical presentation. There won't be any econometrics or any theoretical models, um, but I hope it will stimulate our discussion. So what I plan to do is, in the first half dozen slides, to talk about the Millennium Development Goals, how they were financed, how they were achieved, as a backdrop to the Sustainable Development Goals process. To talk about why the Sustainable Development Goals are different, much more ambitious, much more difficult to finance, and to assess whether we can really make the shift from billions to trillions that Jim Kim termed it, the former president of the World Bank, when he discussed the goals. So as you remember, there were 8 Millennium Development Goals with an associated 29 targets. And of these 8, at least half were related to health, so health or nutrition. So that was a big, big focus of the Millennium Development Goals. And those are things that are relatively more straightforward to track than some of the topics that were raised in the Sustainable Development Goals. And the way that the Millennium Development Goals were set was there was a period of social unrest, concern about the difficulties that were facing the low and middle income countries following the 1980s, the lost decade for development, and the huge debt burden that faced those countries and hampered their growth. So throughout the 1990s, there were protests, often at the G7 or the G20 meetings, to say something has to be done. And the millennium was chosen as a focal point because there was the idea that at the millennium, debts would be forgiven. So as you know, that's not exactly what happened, but setting the Millennium Development Goals was a way of amassing funding that could vastly improve things for the low and middle income countries, because the MDGs focused on the low and middle income countries. So they were announced in 2000 at the UN, but at that time there had not been a lot of discussion as to even what the level of the baseline where we were currently with those targets. And also there was little forethought as to how the goals were going to be financed. So there was a big flurry of activity for the first couple of years, literally to figure out what was going to be done before 2015. And 1990 was taken as the baseline rather than 2000, because obviously in 2000, we didn't exactly know from what level we were starting. So, as you know, some of the goals were met and some were not. Some of the notable ones were halving the poverty level and also halving the proportion of those who had no access to safe drinking water, and that one was achieved ahead of time. And in education, there were good achievements. But it's a glass half full, glass half empty. Some of the other goals were not achieved. A couple of the health goals were very, very ambitious. To reduce child mortality by 2/3 was a very aspirational goal. And we did not reach that, but child mortality halved. And similarly, maternal mortality improved substantially, but not by the extent that was in the goals. And some of the goals themselves were more diffuse and more difficult to achieve. For example, the actions on the environment. It's much harder to quantify that than to quantify the mortality targets. So when I discuss this with my students, I often say, when you set goals, you have to set stretch goals. If you're going on a diet, you don't say, wow, I'd really like to lose 2 pounds. You make a larger target to really change your behavior. And even if you don't fully achieve it, you will have made some substantial progress. And I think that's what happened with the Millennium Development Goals. Some of the goals were more expensive to achieve. It's a lot cheaper to produce safe drinking water than it is to improve sanitation. So that's why the drinking water goal was achieved, and it's one reason why it was much more difficult to achieve the goals in sanitation. So speaking of financing, Kofi Annan was the UN Secretary General at the time of the Millennium Development Goals and up until 2007. So he had a key role in the process. And it happened that he was quite closely linked with Jeff Sachs. Jeff Sachs, who's now at Columbia, he was the one who was called on by the UN Secretary General to try to estimate the cost of achieving the Millennium Development Goals. And the cost was seen as ambitious in the billions of dollars, but it was seen as feasible if development assistance would rise in real terms. And I'm sure you remember the 0.7% of GDP target that the donor countries are supposed to achieve. But most countries do not achieve that. But nevertheless, over the Millennium Development Goals, there was more effort to increase aid. I think on the next slide, it tells you that 5 countries actually achieved the 0.7% of GDP target, mainly the Nordic countries, but surprisingly, UK also made a big effort. Another accompanying feature of the Millennium Development Goal process was a change in mindset. A whole host of new organizations were set up, in some cases working hand in hand with the UN agencies, but in other cases, the aim was to apply a more private sector mindset to the operations. So the Gates Foundation, which was also an important factor, was set up in 2000. And these various organizations, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, was set up in 2000. The Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition and the Global Fund were set up in 2002, and UNITAID was set up in 2006. And they had a much more results-based focus, and they also sought to obtain innovative finance. So maybe you have heard of Project Red, or Comic Relief, and these were ways to try and tap new funding directly from individuals rather than just going through governments. So what's been different about the Sustainable Development Goals? So these were set up with a lot more advanced planning than the Millennium Development Goals. At the Rio +20 conference, the idea came forward, and then there was a process over 2 years of widespread consultations. And as you can imagine, it's a more bottom-up, more inclusive process, and the end result was that there were far more goals set and far more priorities included than in the kind of top-down process by which the Millennium Development Goals were developed. Another difference is that the Sustainable Development Goals are one world goals. They apply to all countries. You know, the health target applies also to rich countries to do more for the marginalized in their own countries. And Ban Ki-moon had the phrase of leave no one behind. So inequality was a big issue, you know, and indeed it's been socially a big issue in the news. So there were 17 Sustainable Development Goals set with, I think it's 169 targets, an enormous shopping list. You know, again, I don't know if you set New Year's resolutions for yourself, but probably you wouldn't set as many as 17 with 169 targets. You know, to an economist, it makes sense to prioritize. You know, but the process of developing the goals led to this very large and ambitious agenda. You know, I'm going to just show you 2 slides on goal 16, a very important goal, But if you read it, you can see it's very ambitious. It's going to be very difficult to measure. And there were even concerns from many of the poorer countries that their statistical agencies simply would not be able to even measure all these goals, the achievement of all these goals. So this is a far cry from halving maternal mortality. And at the same time, the financing was much more ambitious. So the UN General Assembly estimated 6 trillion annually for 15 years would be required, as compared to the billions that were required for the Millennium Development Goals. And just to put that into context, 6 trillion is 10 times the outstanding stock of lending of the largest 5 development banks. It's 7% of world GDP. Very, very ambitious. So the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some of the innovative financing methods that people thought of to try and finance the goals. So firstly, private philanthropy. We already talked about Gates Foundation, and we'll see Gates has had a wider impact on the notion of giving. Blended finance, which is where you bring in private sector funding in partnership with public sector funding, and then something called impact investment. So on this slide, you can see 3 of the 5 richest households in North America. I was going to say North America, but I'm sure US is correct as well. So, and in the center, you have Bill and Melinda Gates. On the left, you can see Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan. Mark is the founder of Facebook, and Warren Buffett on the right side. So I didn't include pictures of Larry Ellison, the co-founder of Oracle, or of Jeff Bezos, who is indeed the richest man in the world. So Bill Gates himself made the target with Melinda that they would donate half of their fortune to charity over their lifetime. And then he also founded something called the Giving Pledge, where he tried to convince other colleagues, other similarly wealthy individuals, to give funding and to make the same pledge, about half of their fortune. So 4 of the top 5 richest people in the US have indeed agreed to do this. So Zuckerberg has the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Warren Buffett himself doesn't have a foundation, but his children do, and he is donating a large proportion of his wealth through the Gates Foundation. Larry Ellison has a foundation. The interesting one is Jeff Bezos, who does not. Interestingly, his mother and stepfather, who invested $250,000 at the start of his online business, now have a $30 billion foundation based on the proceeds. And Jeff Bezos' ex-wife also has a large foundation, but Jeff Bezos has not participated in this as yet. But it's not just about the very richest people donating money and using it for social good. But this has become a more widespread practice. So Charity Navigator is an organization that's actually called Charity Navigator, but it's also one of a group of organizations that helps to provide an informed guide as to where your dollars can do the most good. So they evaluate charities and try to suggest those that have the best bang for the buck. Okay, and it's been somewhat of a trend. GiveWell is an organization that was a group of friends from the financial industry who wanted to make the most value for their donations. And in the end, 2 of them quit their jobs in finance to spend all their time doing research on what the best value investments were for their colleagues. And the Giving What We Can is an organization that Toby Ord at Oxford set up to get people to commit to giving 1/10 of their fortunes over their lifetime. Similar to the idea of tithing in the church, or I think it's called zakat in the Muslim religion. Okay, so philanthropy is one possibility. Blended finance is where governments encourage their contribution to leverage private funding. So in some sense, the governments take some of the risk in order to encourage the private sector to invest in worthy projects in low and middle income countries. Because with the way interest rates were in the low and middle income countries, that's where the higher returns on investment are, as long as some of the risk can be offloaded to governments. So Convergence is based in Toronto, where I live, but is the global network for this effort. And here are some of the government agencies that engage in blended finance. So it's not by any means a new thing. CDC used to be called the Colonial Development Corporation and was set up in the UK in 1946. And the other organizations here include the US one, I've included the Canadian one, and the one from the Netherlands. And then also the World Bank uses this same kind of leveraging concept of in using public funds, but then leveraging private funds. So as you might expect, the COVID pandemic has led to the activation of the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility. But although it was 500 million, that's really a drop in the bucket compared to the needs with the COVID pandemic. But it was an important idea. Another thing you may have heard of is social impact bonds. So these two slides from the Brookings Institute give you some information about social impact bonds, which are, as you might expect, devoted to the social sectors, but getting private funding to invest in these sectors. And the next slide has information about the development impact bonds. So they're known as SIBs and DIBs. Indeed, these have done very important things. For example, in Cameroon, they've helped to finance an eye hospital, for cataract surgery, etc. In Cameroon, they've been used for an initiative called Kangaroo Mothers to try to help newborns who are premature by literally carrying them in a pouch on one of the parents at all times. That helps to improve their nutrition and their health. So, very innovative ideas. These take a while to develop. As you can see from the slides, they're not huge in terms of total amount financed. The outstanding stock is, less than $500 million. And if you're trying to get to trillions, I guess every $500 million helps, but you need a lot of them. Impact investing is, again, something you may have heard of, the triple bottom line, where you think not just of the economic benefits, but also social and environmental benefits when you do investing. And this can be applied to individuals, to groups, to pension funds. Okay, it's a concept that came about in the 1990s. The Heron Foundation was one of the first to say that they would do this. And subsequently, the Ford Foundation followed. And what the Ford Foundation said is, we don't want to just invest the interest on our large endowment in things that are socially valuable. We want to be all in and invest our whole endowment. So this is a trend that's also been followed by individuals and wealthy people. So the GIN is the Global Impact Investment Network, and they meet and work to cooperate on this. The book cover on the left is from UNEP, the UN Environmental Program, and has principles for impact investing. And it's the environmental area that was one of the leaders in the idea of the triple bottom line. And pension funds have followed on this too. So these particular funds, PGGM is the second largest pension fund in Netherlands. CalPERS is the California, my notes here, this is the California pension fund for, I think it's the public sector employees, and CBIZ in Australia is the superannuation fund for the construction and building trades. And Ontario Teachers Pension Fund is obviously from Canada, where I live, and is one of a dozen large pension funds that pledged at one of the G7 meetings to invest in things that were related to the Sustainable Development Goals. And this can really make a difference. The funds who have committed to investing in line with the Sustainable Development Goals have 6 trillion in assets. So that can potentially make a difference. So the last part of the talk, maybe half dozen slides, is about the SDGs and whether or not COVID will derail process. So as always, the glass is half full and half empty. So we'll start with the bad news. The bad news is that the COVID pandemic has been disastrous for potential financing for the Sustainable Development Goals, because most countries are struggling to try and ameliorate the worst impacts on their populations, particularly on the poorest. So remittances have dropped because marginalized workers in the high-income countries have lost their jobs and can no longer send this important finance to their countries of origin. Private investment in Africa has been decimated. It says here 85 countries had gone to the IMF by mid-April. It's been more since then. And Gallagher, who's at BU in Boston, along with colleagues, suggested that the need for the emerging markets and developing economies was 2.5 trillion, which completely dwarfs the funding available from the IMF and the regional banks. And as you know, it's not just an economic process, but it's about leadership and commitment. The MDGs were successful in part because of strong leadership by Kofi Annan and by his links to economists in terms of mobilizing financing and philanthropy as well. But we're in very different times. Some people have said that this is the US's Suez moment, the time when Britain realized, or people realized, Britain was a declining superpower was with the Suez Canal fiasco, a disastrous military endeavor. So we now have the issues of China and the US and the struggles over what's going to happen to the multilateral organizations. The US has retreated from its support of organizations like the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization, and that will have impacts. And although other countries are stepping up, it's left a big void. So there are many threats to the Sustainable Development Goals. On the positive side, if we could achieve or make progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, it will help us in future pandemics. If we have universal health coverage, it will make it easier for people to access testing without any cost to them, or to access treatment without financial toxicity to them. And I put some other examples here of how the SDG goals should become even more relevant than ever for those people who are advocating that we should eat less meat. what's happening in the meat packing plants and the spread of COVID should be a wake-up call. So I think there are two possible futures. One future is deglobalization. People retreat behind their national tariff walls in the same way as happened in the 1930s. We have a vacuum at the center where we do not have strong multilateral organizations who are encouraging us to work together. Or perhaps the Sustainable Development Goals are a piece of the puzzle that will help us get through this terrible time. Clearly, the goals will be somewhat set back. One of my colleagues who works on TB said he foresees a 5-year setback to the health goals. You know, COVID has decimated access to vaccinations in low and middle income countries. People are using the health facilities less because of fear of infection, and it's a huge setback. You know, but on the other hand, maybe we can accept that, think about how to redefine the goals and how to move on. Okay, I have one last quick slide, which gives the sources of the two graphics that I used in the two previous slides, and also a chapter that I wrote, which has more detail on the financing. Okay, and I'm going to try and move back to this slide, and at this point to look forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you. So I'm passing this back to Di at this point, who is going to moderate the discussion.
Very much, Sue. That was very interesting. And I guess you're struggling with the same problem that all of us are, that the crystal ball is not very clear quite yet. We've only had a couple of the questions are starting to come in, and Sue, if it's easier for you to read the questions and just respond, then you know, feel free to do that. But in the first question was really around the political economy, and what is likely to be the impact on the Sustainable Development Goals of the deteriorating political relationship between economically powerful countries. And I suspect here that one of the key ones is the situation between the US and China, which could have considerable implications for pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals and for financing. So if you are able to speak a little bit about some of the issues around political relationships between economically powerful countries, that would be great. Passing back to Sue.
Okay, well equipped to answer. But yeah, clearly this is going to be one of the key factors, and what happens in the US in their election in November, you know, will have indelible consequences for all of us in the rest of the world. So during the Millennium Development Goals, it was indeed very important that there was international collaboration. You know, at every G7 or G20 meeting, the Millennium Development Goals were brought up, and countries were, you know, their feet were held to the fire to commit funding for different components of the goals. So, you know, I'm in Canada, and Stephen Harper, when he hosted one of the G7 meetings in Canada, he encouraged other people to donate to the Every Woman, Every Child initiative, which was related to the Millennium Development Goals on maternal and child health. And similarly, other leaders, when they hosted those summits, would highlight one of the key goals that was a particular interest to them, and again get countries to donate. So those were a lot more cooperative times. Currently, we foresee that there'll be issues holding the G7. The US is trying to hold it in person, and they are the chair or president of the G7 at the moment, or used to be G8, and we just have seen the body language, etc., at previous meetings, and we just I think are very concerned about it. I mean, obviously, China is a really rising power. They have been probably underappreciated. I mean, they've been trying to get the renminbi put into the basket of SDR currencies at the IMF. And clearly we are slowly recognizing their rising power. And they are moving quite substantially to increase their soft power at the same time as the US is declining its soft power. I read yesterday that the Chinese have, I think, is it 5 or 7 COVID vaccines in development, and they have pledged to make them available to the developing countries, whereas the US has its Make America Great Again, America First and Only America policy with its vaccines. We've seen the news that the US was trying to buy up patent rights even to other countries' vaccines. So I think the questioner, Sumita Saha, raised a great and very important question. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Di, to move on to another question.
A couple more questions have come through, and one of them is around the issue of growing nationalism, which relates to what you were talking about just now. But it seems to me that it resonates. I think that there's an issue that you were raising earlier about the glass is half full and is it half full or half empty. So on the one hand, with during the pandemic, we've seen a massive growth in nationalism and, as you say, country lockdown and it's with comments like President Trump saying America first, and with Brexit, again putting Britain first, that has then been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which could potentially have some impact in terms of donor countries being willing to fund sustainable development goals and having an impact on the global south. But also at the same time, one of the phrases that I've heard used very frequently during this COVID pandemic is that it has highlighted our common humanity. And there is also a sense that people are becoming more aware that we are one humanity, and something like COVID affects everyone and every country, and that might encourage particularly individuals. You were highlighting that the importance of in the SDG financing is that it's not being put on governments as much, but there's also a lot of private philanthropy. So I don't know if you'd like to comment on that, but it might be just a case of glass half full, glass half empty, and we need to wait to see how this pans out. But over to you, Sue.
Thank you. So, and we think about things like in the UK where they're doing clap for carers once a week, where people go and applaud and thank those people who are doing frontline health work. But on the other hand, not everybody feels like we're in this together. I mean, maybe I'm biased because we live right next door to the US. You know, I'm like just over the lake, literally less than 100 miles from the US. And we see what inequality is coming out of the COVID pandemic too. We see that the people who are losing their jobs or the people who are working currently in the riskiest frontline jobs are the poorest or minorities or people of color. And I've also seen statistics on women being disproportionately those who've lost their jobs. You know, in Singapore, it was the migrants who lost their jobs first, and the epidemic rebounded because of migrant workers living in poor conditions, crowded together in dormitories. So, but I think inequality was one of the big issues of since 2000. We'd had this long period of expansive globalization, economic growth, but it had not brought everyone along. There was not this feeling of leave no one behind. People were getting left behind. And that was corrosive to the feeling that we're all in this together, you know, and we must work together. People were feeling like, no, I am marginalized. My needs have been ignored. So I think there's a balance there. And I think a lot of the efforts towards deglobalization, nationalism, retreating behind national boundaries are tied to these feelings of inequality, and that, you know, you can't appeal to we're all in this together to the people who have not been benefiting from the prosperity. Okay, so thanks, Di. And there is the next question, and I saw was, if you want me to take this up, it's a very interesting question by Mohammed Huck, who asked about lockdown and mental health. And I think if that's okay with you, Di, I'm going to answer that one next. So, you know, this is something we simply don't have enough information on. You know, there are concerns that people who are locked up, you know, like the Spanish households in their apartments for 7 weeks, those people without balconies who were literally not allowed out, their children were not allowed out of the house. You can imagine people get very frustrated, and intimate partner violence probably increased. I think that's really a ripe research topic. Okay, and in fact, with one of my PhD students, we have started a new project on that. My incoming PhD student is interested in disabilities, and with a particular group of those who live with disabilities. And so we got a small amount of funding to do some very quick one-on-one interviews to those living with disabilities who have special issues to face under the lockdown. I mean, for many of them, it's much worse than for the rest of us if they are not able to get their usual supports. But on the other hand, for people who are introvert or agoraphobic, it may be easier to live under these conditions. And I think this is something we need to think about, because governments did not have this information to guide their policy for lockdown. Okay, so great question. I'm going to pass it back to you, Di, for the next question.
I think those covered most of the questions, but there is a comment that was put in, and I'm going to express it. I wonder whether one of the biggest impacts of COVID in relation to the SDGs is going to be on the issue of inequalities. You highlighted that the SDGs is trying to pay particular attention to inequalities. And this was one of the things that came out of the Millennium Development Goals, that although some of the Millennium Goals were achieved, or there had been substantial progress towards achieving them, this happened within a context sometimes of increasing inequalities. And that's why the SDGs now also give quite a lot of emphasis to inequalities. And as you said, the slogan of leave no one behind. But it is clear that, or it seems, certainly some of the issues that are coming up is that COVID is affecting different groups and different individuals in different ways, and seems that it is leading, or it could be leading to greater inequalities between age groups. And this is the comments that were raised, older people, they have the highest risk of COVID, they're more likely to live alone and not be able to communicate using emails, etc., and are likely to be quite adversely affected. Women are more likely to be carers. Certainly this was something that I heard today, that a very high percentage of those who have lost jobs are women. There's also racial or ethnic issues, and certainly it seems, and I hope that it's an area that is going to be quite widely researched, that actually COVID is going to increase inequalities within countries, and I think also between countries, with the most vulnerable becoming even more vulnerable. And so I wonder if that is not going to be one of the worst legacies of COVID in relation to the SDGs, that although funding might still become available, although there may be some progress, again, it might be at the average level, at the overall level, and that inequalities at the end of the SDG period may not have been reduced quite as much. So, Sue, I don't know if you'd like to comment on that. I see a couple more questions have come in, and we've got still a couple of minutes. So I'll hand back to Sue for the moment.
Yeah, thank you. It's great that many more economists are now working on this topic. The World Inequality Lab, based in Paris, is doing really important work to document this. And that the group of economists there writing about it have really brought this much more to the forefront. So you've talked about some of the bad effects of COVID on inequality, but let me also raise a different set of issues. So during the pandemic, our ability to use things like Amazon and the internet has been, one of the factors that has been helping at least those people who are rich enough to take advantage of that. But let's think a bit more about this. I mean, Jeff Bezos has gotten substantially richer over the pandemic, and I don't know the name of the person who founded Zoom, but Zoom has really taken off. But we have a poorly set up international framework for taxing these kinds of multinational borderless businesses. For example, many of these do not pay very much by way of taxes. They have, Google, I think, has these clever arrangements whereby their IP is headquartered in Ireland, and then there's something that I don't fully understand called the double Dutch Irish sandwich or something like that, where using perfectly legal means, payments are passed between a couple of different countries without hitting any taxation and disappear into the Cayman Islands. So maybe it's only just that the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world are donating part of their wealth to philanthropic purposes, because after all, we are doing a very poor job of taxing them. So maybe that's a rather controversial point to raise, but inequality, yeah, it's a big issue. And, post-COVID, the increases in inequality that COVID has brought about, is going to be important. So I did see another very interesting question on education, something I haven't talked about a lot. But we know from the Asian financial crisis that kids dropping out of school during the financial crisis who then never got back into school was a big issue. It permanently scars these individuals. They don't ever attain the education that they might have attained, and it damages their future learning prospects. And these kids drop out because the parents can't afford to send them to school. They can't afford the internet. They don't have access to the internet, so they can't take a benefit from online lessons. I mean, even in my own country, which we pride ourselves on a more egalitarian educational system, those kids who don't have access to the internet and the libraries are all closed, their opportunities to learn during the pandemic will be harmed. There's no question about it. So I answered a couple of questions there. Di, I'm going to pass it to you again.
There's also a question about whether it's whether the trend of working from home is moving forward technological disruption on jobs and hence increase inequality. But I'm also just going to raise the other issue that is raised here. I mean, just in terms of the trend of working from home, quite a lot of it is anecdotal, but it does seem that quite a lot of people and companies are finding that where people are able to work from home, they might actually make savings on getting rid of their office space. And so it does seem that it could have implications into the future. And clearly, those who are able to work from home do tend to fall more into kind of highly paid professions. And so that would seem to be able to increase or contribute to increases in inequality. So you could maybe touch on that. But the last question, and I think then we should wrap up, is the whole issue of data collection, and that it is difficult at the best of times in many low and middle income countries. But, in this period, it's going to be very difficult to collect data to monitor progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And do you have any sense about how the disruption created by COVID would impact on monitoring and evaluation of the SDGs? And as I say, if we could make that the last question. So I'm just handing back to Sue.
And yes, I mean, I recognize I'm tremendously privileged because I can do my work from home. I have my computer, I have Zoom, and yes, since I do international work, it's a loss to me that I can't go spend time in the countries in which I'm working because there's no substitute for that. On the other hand, there are going to be big implications of the work at home change. For example, I was just watching on TV this morning that doctors now are doing many more virtual consultations. And we can see that as being a good trend for, frail individuals who don't want to travel to go to the doctor's office, don't want to be subjected to infection. I think that's going to be a trend that's going to continue. And another good thing about the working from home thing is environmental. As we know, all the airlines have been not completely grounded, but I think less than 10% of the flights are still occurring, and that will have good environmental benefits. Less commuting to work may improve the environment. Use of bicycles in the city. In Toronto, they are closing streets. They're thinking of closing streets and increasing bike lanes, and that's going to be good for not only the environment, but also potentially for obesity, giving people more regular opportunities to bicycle to work for those that have to go to work and don't want to use public transit. But it will also have big implications. If fewer people go to work in the office and there's more hoteling, it's going to have implications on renting of office space in the same way that we're seeing potential death of the suburban malls with online. So, yep, very interesting question. And Sakshi, I saw, asked the question about how can we collect data in these times where we can't meet people face to face and knock on doors. So in high-income countries, it's less of an issue because we can, use virtual means to contact with people. But of course, then we lose information from the most vulnerable, especially the homeless, those who don't have connectivity. And we won't hear the voice of people who are very elderly or confused, who aren't able to use iPads and computers for connection. So, that's an issue. It will impart bias to our to what we can find. And in the project that I mentioned, where we are looking at the effect of COVID on people being at home with disabilities, it's proved very tricky. I mean, I was not up on how to get consent from people on the internet, especially people who might not have full ability to consent, and how could we evaluate that on the internet? So it's thrown up all kinds of new issues for us to think about. Okay, and with that, I'll thank everybody who's provided these questions. Very stimulating food for thought. And thanks for having me participate in this very interesting webinar. Over to you, Di.
Thank you very much to everyone for participating, but just to thank particularly Sue for making the time to share your insights with us. And just to say, one of the things that really struck me, and I know that we all get very down during this time, and I was just struck by how when we raised issues about what's potentially negative, you always came up with great positives. Yes, but there's more actual engagement between doctors, remote medicine, etc., etc. So for me, that was really one of the highlights of your input, was looking at, yes, there potentially very serious problems and challenges, but also there's wonderful opportunities, and it's really up to us how we take that forward, and how we advocate to use the opportunities, and how we advocate around trying to address some of the challenges. But thank you very, very much for that. Thanks everyone, and we look forward to you participating on our next webinar.